The wind howled across the open plains like a wounded thing, rattling the shutters of the small cabin that stood lonely against the storm. Inside, Jonas Hawley paced the wooden floorboards, his boots thudding in rhythm with the ragged cry of his newborn daughter. The baby's wails pierced the silence. Thin and desperate, the sound of life clinging to the edge of the world, Jonas held her close, his big, calloused hands trembling. He had faced stampeding cattle, wildfires, and men who would shoot him for the land beneath his boots, but nothing had ever frightened him like the weight of this tiny, helpless child. Her skin was pale, her breath shallow. Her cry fading between gasps. On the cot behind him lay a shape covered by a quilt, still, cold, silent. His wife, Anna, had been gone 2 days now. The childbirth that brought their daughter into the world had taken her out of it. He hadn't eaten, hadn't slept, just sat by the fire, listening to the baby cry and the wind scream through the eaves. The cow in the barn had gone dry. The jar of milk he'd tried warming earlier had spoiled. He had nothing left to feed her. Every hour, he prayed for a miracle that didn't come. Jonas's jaw tightened as he looked at the baby's face. Anna's eyes staring back at him, too small, too fragile. "Hold on, little one," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Your pa's gonna make it right. I swear it." He wrapped her in a blanket, pulled on his coat, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a wall. Snow whipped across the plains in wild sheets, the world white and merciless. The lantern's flame struggled against the wind as he saddled his horse, Duke, who snorted and stomped in protest. "Come on, boy," Jonas murmured, mounting up. "We can't let her die." The horse pushed through the drifts, hooves sinking deep into the frozen earth. Jonas hunched over the infant, shielding her from the wind with his coat. His eyes burned from the snow, his lips numb. Every gust stung like shards of glass. But he kept riding, through the endless dark, past the split rail fences and frozen creeks. He thought of Anna's laugh, the way her hand used to rest against his arm when she told him stories by the fire. He thought of how she had smiled when she told him she wanted to name their baby Grace, because she said every hard man needed a little of it in his life. Now that name echoed in his mind like a prayer he didn't know how to finish. Hours passed, but no light appeared on the horizon, no smoke from another homestead, no hope. The storm was too strong. Duke's sides heaved, and Jonas's hands were stiff around the reins. He couldn't feel his fingers anymore. When he looked down at the baby, her eyes were closed, her tiny lips barely moving. Panic clawed at his throat. He dismounted, pressing her to his chest. Trying to share what little warmth he had left, his breath came out in clouds of frost. "Don't you quit on me," he pleaded. "You hear me, Grace? Don't you quit." He turned the horse back toward home. The wind screamed louder now, as if mocking him. By the time he reached the cabin, dawn was only a faint glow behind the clouds. Jonas stumbled inside, collapsed by the fire, and pulled the baby close again. Her cry had turned soft, weak, but still there. He held her tighter, whispering through chattering teeth, "We made it. We made it." But even as he said it, he knew they hadn't. The milk was gone, the cow was dry, the storm had stolen any chance of reaching town. He sat there, broken, the baby's breath against his chest, the only proof that life still existed in that frozen place. The fire sputtered low. He bowed his head, tears cutting through the grime on his face, and whispered the only prayer he had left, "Lord, send someone." Outside, the storm began to ease. In the distance, past the bare branches and white drifts, a faint lantern light flickered from another cabin, a sign that someone had heard. And before the next dawn, a knock would come on Jonas Hale's door. The morning after the storm broke over the plains, a stillness settled across the land, the kind that came only after something fierce had spent itself. The snow lay heavy on the roofs, the fences, and the barren fields, sparkling faintly in the pale sun. Smoke no longer rose from Jonas Hale's chimney, but at a cabin half a mile away, Clara Dawson was already awake. She was only 19, slight as a willow, with hands roughened by work and eyes that had seen too much sorrow for her years. She had been alone since her father died that autumn, a quiet man who had once traded horses with Jonas, but rarely spoke beyond what business required. Clara had learned to fend for herself, chopping wood, tending her few hens, hauling water from the well that morning. As she poured feed into a tin pail, she heard it, faint at first, like a cry carried on the wind. She froze, listening. There it was again, weak, trembling, the unmistakable sound of a baby's wail. Her heart leapt. The nearest neighbors beyond the Hales were miles off. She dropped the pail, grabbed her shawl, and started through the snow. The cold bit into her cheeks, the drifts rising nearly to her knees, but she didn't stop. Something in that cry had pierced her chest, desperate, fading, alive when she reached the Hale cabin. She hesitated. The place looked abandoned, the barn door half open, the corral gate hanging askew. No movement at all? Then she saw it, a faint wisp of smoke curling from the chimney. As if from a dying fire she climbed the steps, lifted her hand, and knocked for a long moment. Nothing. Then from inside a rough voice said, "Go away." Clara flinched but didn't move. "Mr. Hale?" She called through the door. "It's Clara Dawson." "I heard." "Go home," came the reply, hoarse and ragged. Her throat tightened. She hesitated, then pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, and the smell hit her, wood smoke, sweat, and grief. Inside, Jonas sat by the hearth, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. In his arms, wrapped in a quilt, was a baby, her tiny face pale as milk, her lips dry. Clara stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "She's hungry," she whispered. Jonas looked up then, and for the first time she saw the man behind the legend, the rancher folks called stone-hearted, who never smiled and kept to himself. His eyes were hollow, rimmed red. "She's dying," he said simply. Clara knelt beside him, her heart breaking at the sight. "No," she murmured, shaking her head. "She just needs to be fed." He stared at her, uncomprehending. Then realization flickered in his eyes, shame, confusion, a kind of desperate hope. "I've got no milk left," he muttered. "The cow went dry." "I rode to town, but I can help," Clara interrupted softly. Her voice trembled. "I can feed her." Jonas blinked, as if not believing he'd heard right. Then understanding dawned, and his breath caught "Miss Dawson." She met his gaze steadily, though her cheeks flushed crimson. "Please," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Let me help her." "It's what your wife would have wanted." Something in that name, wife, cracked through the wall he'd built around himself. He turned his head away, jaw tight. For a long, silent moment, the only sound was the fire popping and the baby's weak cry. Then Jonas nodded once Clara took the infant gently from his arms, her hands trembling as she cradled the tiny bundle against her. The baby's lips latched eagerly, instinctively, and a soft, broken sound escaped her, a contented sigh. Tears filled Clara's eyes as relief washed through her. Jonas stared, his throat working, his hand clenched against his knee. He wanted to speak, to thank her, to apologize, to say anything, but no words came. When the baby finished, Clara looked up at him, her expression tender and uncertain. "She's strong," she said softly. "She just needed someone to care." Jonas swallowed hard, his voice rough. "So did I." For the first time in weeks, the cabin felt warm again, not from the fire, but from something fragile and human that neither of them had dared to hope for mercy outside. The snow began to melt under the pale sun inside. A man and a girl sat close by the hearth, a baby sleeping between them, 3 souls brought together by loss, by need, and by something that felt a little like grace. The wind had quieted, and the world outside Jonas Hale's cabin was turning from white to gold. The storm had broken, but the silence it left behind was heavy, a stillness that made every sound inside feel louder, more alive. The crackle of the fire, the soft coo of a newborn, the quiet rhythm of another person breathing in the same room. That person was Clara Dawson, the neighbor girl who had knocked on his door when all hope was gone. Jonas watched her as she sat near the hearth, rocking little Grace in her arms. The baby's cheeks were full again, her eyes open, curious. It had been only 3 days since Clara had arrived, but already the cabin felt changed. Where grief had once filled every corner, now there was life, faint, tender, and growing. Jonas had lived alone most of his life, even before Anna came along. He'd never been good with people. His words came out hard when he meant them soft, and silence always felt safer than speaking. But with Clara there, he found himself listening to her hum as she worked, or catching the small half-smile she gave when the baby's hand grasped her finger each morning. She returned from her small homestead half a mile away, always carrying something. Sometimes it was milk from her goat, sometimes a loaf of bread, sometimes nothing but a quiet determination to make sure the child lived another day. Jonas tried to stop her at first. "You've done enough," he told her one morning. When she arrived with a pail of warm milk, Clara didn't even pause in setting it down by the fire. "I'll decide that," she replied gently, brushing snow from her skirt. Jonas frowned. "You shouldn't be wasting your time here. You've got your own chores." "I've got 2 hands," she said with a soft shrug. "One's for my work, the other's for when someone needs help." Her words landed harder than he expected. No one had talked to him like that in months, maybe years. Most folks in the valley avoided him since Anna's death. Some whispered that he'd gone cold as stone. But Clara? She looked him straight in the eye and spoke plain. Over the days that followed, she began to fill the silences he didn't know how to break. She told him stories about her father, a quiet man who used to trade with the Apache down south, who'd taught her how to track the stars and how to listen to the earth. She spoke about losing him last fall, about the empty cabin she went home to each night. Her voice would waver sometimes, but she never asked for pity. Jonas realized they were both ghosts of a sort, 2 souls still walking through the wreckage of what they'd lost that evening. When the sun dipped low and turned the snow to rose gold, Clara finished feeding Grace and laid her in the cradle. The baby sighed softly, her tiny fist resting near her mouth. Jonas watched from his chair, his hands folded tight. "You're good with her," he said quietly. Clara looked up, surprised by the compliment. "I just do what comes natural." He hesitated, then said, "Still, you've done more than I ever could." She shook her head. "No, Mr. Hawley, you stayed. You didn't give up on her. That's the hardest part." Jonas's gaze dropped to the floorboards. "I wanted to," he admitted, his voice rough. "That night, before you came, I was near ready to lay down and let the cold take me." Clara stepped closer, her eyes glistening in the firelight. "Then I'm glad I heard her cry," she whispered. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was soft, like the hush before a prayer. When Clara finally stood to leave, Jonas walked her to the door. The snow had begun to melt, and patches of brown earth showed through. The air smelled of thawing grass. "The first breath of spring. You'll come back tomorrow?" he asked, almost shyly. She smiled, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "If you don't mind the company." "I don't," he said after she left. Jonas stood in the doorway, watching her figure fade down the trail until the horizon swallowed her whole. Then he turned back inside, where the baby slept soundly by the fire. He didn't say it aloud, not yet, but deep down, Jonas knew something had shifted. The stranger's kindness hadn't just saved his child. It had begun to save him too. The plains had begun to turn green again, the hard winter giving way to gentle winds and the first blush of wildflowers. Each day dawned a little warmer, and each evening lingered a little longer before the stars came out. Life was returning to the land and to the hearts of those who lived upon it for Jonas Hawley. The widowed rancher, the rhythm of the days had become gentler. The baby, Grace, had grown stronger, her laughter now a soft melody that filled the once silent cabin. And Maggie Dawson, the young neighbor girl whose kindness had saved them both, had become a fixture in their world she visited often, sometimes bringing food, sometimes just her company. Together, she and Jonas repaired the things winter had broken: the sagging roof that leaked when it rained, the fence that had given way to drifting snow, the corral gate that creaked and moaned. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a quiet, steady companionship that needed no explanation. Jonas taught Maggie how to mend a saddle strap. She showed him how to calm the baby when Grace grew fussy. In the evenings, when the chores were done, they'd sit on the porch with Grace sleeping in a basket beside them. Watching the sun dip behind the ridges, it was during one of those evenings that Maggie laughed, a soft, lilting sound that startled him with how good it felt to hear. "You look better when you smile." "You know," she said, teasing gently. Jonas shook his head, his lips twitching despite himself. "Don't much practice it." "Then I reckon you should start," she replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You've got a baby to teach." That was how it was, simple, easy, almost too natural. It felt like healing, but the world beyond their valley didn't see it that way. The small town of Willow Creek was miles away, but word traveled faster than the wind across the plains. At the general store, in the pews of the church, on the porch of the saloon, tongues began to wag. A widowed rancher, a young, unmarried woman visiting his home day after day. Shameful. Someone muttered, "That poor girl don't know what folks are saying, or maybe she does." Another replied with a smirk. The whispers grew, carried by gossip and envy, and soon enough they reached Jonas. He heard it first from Eli Turner, a neighbor who stopped by for feed. Eli mentioned it casually, half grinning as he leaned on the fence. "You might want to watch yourself, Hawley. Folks been talking and saying you and that Dawson girl are setting tongues on fire." Jonas froze. "What's that supposed to mean?" Eli shrugged. "You know how it is. Folks like a story better when it ain't true." That night, Jonas couldn't sleep. The firelight flickered low, and every creak of the cabin seemed louder than before. He thought of Maggie, her soft laughter, her steady hands, her kindness, and how the world might twist it into something ugly when she came the next morning. Smiling as always, he couldn't meet her eyes. "Morning, Mr. Hawley," she said, setting a basket on the table. "Brought some bread and honey." "Maggie," he interrupted, his tone sharper than he meant. She paused, confused. "What is it?" He set down the tools he was holding and turned to face her. His jaw was tight, his voice rough. "You shouldn't come here anymore." Her face went still. "Why?" "Because people are talking," he said. "About you." "About me." "About what they think's going on." Maggie blinked, the color draining from her cheeks. "And what is going on, Jonas?" "Nothing," he said quickly. "Too quickly. That's why it's best you stop. I won't have them dragging your name through the mud." She looked at him for a long, heavy moment. Her eyes glistened, though her voice stayed steady. "You think I care what they say? You think I'd rather sit alone in that cabin while you struggle here with that baby, just so I can please a few gossiping tongues?" "It ain't about them," he muttered, looking away. "It's about you. You deserve better than the kind of talk that follows a man like me." Her lip trembled, but she lifted her chin. "You're wrong, Jonas. You're the only one who ever made me feel I wasn't alone." And with that, she turned. The screen door creaked shut behind her, leaving silence in her wake. Jonas stood there, fists clenched at his sides, the echo of her words ringing through the empty cabin. Grace stirred in her cradle, letting out a soft cry, a sound that broke him all over again. He walked to the window, watching Maggie's figure grow smaller down the trail. swallowed by the tall grass and the whispering wind. That wind carried more than the scent of spring. Now it carried regret, sharp and cold, and the hollow ache of a man who'd done the right thing the wrong way. After Maggie left, silence settled over Jonas Hale's cabin like a thick winter fog. The laughter that once filled the rooms was gone, replaced by the lonely crackle of the fire and the soft cries of baby Grace. Each day stretched long and hollow, marked only by the sound of the wind against the walls and the baby's restless breathing. Jonas tried to tell himself he'd done the right thing, that sending Maggie away had protected her from cruel gossip and small-town scorn, but as the days turned into weeks, that reasoning felt less like protection and more like punishment. He caught himself looking toward the trail she used to walk, half expecting to see her bright shawl through the cottonwoods. He still glanced at the empty chair by the fire, the one where she'd once sat humming softly while rocking Grace to sleep. Every reminder cut deeper than the last. Then one cold, wet night, his world nearly came apart. Grace had been fussy all day, crying more than usual, her tiny body flushed with heat. Jonas had tried everything, rocking her, cooling her forehead, whispering nonsense words the way Maggie used to do, but by nightfall, her breathing turned shallow and the flush deepened into a frightening red. "Come on, little one," he murmured, his voice breaking. "Stay with me, Grace." The storm outside raged, rain pelting the windows and wind howling through the cracks in the roof. Jonas held the baby close, pacing the room, his heart pounding with fear. The fever wasn't breaking. He could feel her trembling in his arms, could see her tiny chest rising too fast, too weak. That was when pride fell away. He didn't think, he just moved, grabbing his coat. He wrapped Grace in a blanket, pulled on his boots, and stepped out into the night. The rain hit him like icy needles, but he swung into the saddle and urged his horse forward. The lightning splitting the sky above him, the road to the Dawson homestead was a blur of mud and shadows. Storm turned the world to chaos. But Jonas didn't stop. The image of Maggie's face, kind, steady, and full of quiet strength, burned in his mind. He'd told her to stay away, but now she was the only one who could help. By the time he reached her cabin, his clothes were soaked through and his hands numb from the cold. He dismounted and pounded on the door, his voice raw. "Maggie, please open up." It was her mother, Mrs. Dawson, who appeared first, eyes wide in shock. "Jonas Hale, what on earth?" "Grace," he gasped. "She's burning up. I didn't know where else to go." Before Mrs. Dawson could reply, Maggie appeared behind her, her face pale but determined. The moment she saw the baby in his arms, she stepped forward without hesitation. "Bring her inside," she said softly. The warmth of their small kitchen hit him like a wave. Maggie took Grace into her arms, her touch gentle but sure, and laid her near the hearth without a word. She began working, fetching cool cloths, mixing herbs in a bowl, whispering soothing words as she wiped the baby's brow. Jonas watched, his heart twisting. He tried to help, but his hands shook too much. "Tell me what to do," he said hoarsely. "Hold her steady," she answered, her voice calm despite the worry etched on her face. So he did. Together, they worked through the night, trading cloths, feeding sips of cool water, whispering prayers neither of them could quite finish at times. Their hands brushed, fleeting touches that spoke volumes. Neither said a word about what had passed between them, or about the cruel talk of the town. Only the baby mattered, only the warmth of the fire, the rhythm of their movements, and the shared hope that Grace would make it through. Hours crept by. The rain eased, replaced by the soft patter of drops from the eaves. Dawn began to break, pale and tender, and at last, Grace's breathing steadied, her color softened. The fever broke. Jonas slumped back in his chair, exhaustion washing over him across the room. Maggie sat beside the cradle, her head bowed in silent relief. When she looked up, their eyes met, tired, red, but full of something wordless and deep. He swallowed hard. "Maggie, I should not have pushed you away." She shook her head gently. "You did what you thought was right, but it wasn't." He whispered. It wasn't right at all for a moment. The world was still, only the soft crackle of the fire filled the silence between them. Then Maggie smiled faintly, brushing a curl from Grace's forehead. "Let's get her through the morning first, we'll talk after." Jonas nodded. Though his chest felt full of gratitude, of shame, of something tender and dangerous that felt a lot like love outside. The rain had stopped inside. The fire burned warm again, and for the first time in a long while, Jonas Hawley felt something more powerful than loss. Hope. The storm had passed outside the cabin. The first light of dawn crept across the wet earth. Painting the fields in silver and gold, the air smelled of rain and renewal. The world hushed except for the faint chirping of birds testing the quiet inside. The small fire still glowed in the hearth. And the air was thick with the warmth of sleepless care and whispered prayers. Jonas sat slumped beside the cradle, his head bowed, eyes heavy with exhaustion. For hours he had watched Grace's chest rise and fall, counting each breath like a blessing. Now, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, her little body was cool to the touch. Her fever had broken some time before dawn. He let out a shaky breath. Leaning back against the rough wall, his whole body trembled, not from cold, but from the release of a fear so deep it had nearly hollowed him out. Maggie was still beside him, her hair loose and damp from the long night, her face pale but peaceful. She had not left Grace's side once. Her hands, the same hands that had worked with quiet strength through the worst of the night, now rested in her lap. Still and gentle, Jonas looked at her, really looked. The girl he had thought too young, too soft for the hardness of his life, had proven herself stronger than most men he knew. And she had done it not for thanks or pride, but out of a kind of love he hadn't believed still existed. He swallowed hard, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You didn't just save my child." Maggie stirred, blinking at him through tired eyes. Jonas met her gaze, his throat tight. "You saved me." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the baby's soft breathing. Maggie's lips parted, and color rose to her cheeks. She smiled, small, trembling, full of light. "Oh, Jonas," she said softly, brushing a stray curl from Grace's face. "You were never lost. You just needed reminding what it means to be loved." The words hit him harder than a storm ever could. He felt something loosen inside him, the weight of grief, of guilt, of all the silent years since his wife's passing. For so long, he'd lived like a ghost on his own land, working the ranch out of duty, not hope now. Sitting here with this woman and his child safe in her arms, he felt the stirrings of life again, fragile, but real. Grace let out a small coo, stretching her tiny hands in the soft morning light. Both of them laughed quietly, a shared sound of relief and wonder. Jonas reached over, his rough hand finding Maggie's. She hesitated only a moment before letting her fingers slip into his. Warm and steady, the touch said everything words could not. Forgiveness, gratitude, something new and unnamed blooming between them outside. The clouds began to break apart, revealing a sky of pale blue. The storm had scrubbed the land clean. Water glistened on the fences, the trees sparkled, and a rainbow shimmered faintly above the distant ridge. Jonas rose and walked to the window, his hand still holding Maggie's. Together they looked out over the ranch, the corral, the fields, the house that had once felt like a tomb. Now it felt like home again. He turned to her, his voice low but sure. "I don't know what the future holds, but if you'll stay, if you'll have us, I reckon this place might just feel alive again." Maggie's eyes softened, shining with tears. She didn't try to hide Jonas, she whispered. "I think it already does." In that simple exchange, something unspoken took root, not the quick, wild spark of infatuation, but the deep, steady warmth of love born from hardship and grace as the sun climbed higher. Golden light poured through the cabin windows, falling over the cradle, over Maggie's hair, over Jonas's weathered face. He bent down, kissed Grace's forehead, then turned to Maggie and smiled, a smile that reached all the way to his tired, healing heart. The baby cooed again, as if echoing the quiet joy in the room. Jonas looked out at the horizon, where the world stretched wide and bright. The storm had taken much, but it had given something greater in return, a chance to begin again. And in that morning light, surrounded by the scent of rain and the sound of new life, Jonas Hawley finally understood. Hope wasn't something found. It was something rebuilt. One small act of kindness, one long night, one quiet morning at a time.